Have you ever stood beneath the stars and felt the weight of eternity pressing down on you, as if the night sky itself held secrets too vast to comprehend? Now imagine that silence shattered by a blazing streak of fire across the heavens. In the Middle Ages, such a sight would not be met with awe alone, but with dread. To see a comet was to glimpse a heavenly warning, a flaming sign that something terrible was about to unfold. For kings and peasants alike, comets were not just lights in the sky, they were omens, and their appearance shook entire societies to the core. Picture a quiet village in the heart of medieval Europe. The fields have been tilled, the livestock sheltered, the people gathered in cottages warmed by smoky fires. Night falls, and life settles into fragile routine. But then someone points upward, and a hush descends. A fiery trail stretches across the heavens, a streak of brilliance that lingers long after it should fade. Whispers ripple through the crowd. Mothers clutch their children. Old men cross themselves. No one dares to speak too loudly, for they fear the comet may hear their words and turn its fire against them. To us, living in an age of science, a comet is a celestial visitor, an icy traveler from the outer reaches of the solar system. To them, it was a sword wielded by angels, a torch carried by the dead, or a dragon breathing flame across the firmament. The comet was alive, purposeful, charged with meaning. It was never neutral. It was always a message, and the only question was whether it meant plague, war, famine, or the death of kings. Medieval chronicles bristle with these accounts, each one trying to capture the terror of the moment. The comet of 1066, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, blazed across the sky just as Harold Godwinson seized the English throne. To Harold's supporters, it was an omen of disaster, a sign that his rule would not last. To William the Conqueror, it was a fiery banner heralding his victory. And when William triumphed at Hastings, the story of the comet became inseparable from the fate of England itself. A streak of fire in the heavens had rewritten history. But long before 1066, comets had haunted the human imagination. Roman authors described them as heralds of emperors' deaths. In Byzantine accounts, they were tied to invasions and catastrophes. By the Middle Ages, this inheritance of fear had hardened into a cultural truth. If a comet appeared, calamity followed. To deny it was to ignore the will of God written across the sky. Thus, every chronicler, every monk with pen and ink, felt compelled to note these fiery visitors, weaving them into the fabric of history itself. Imagine a monk hunched over his parchment in a candle-lit scriptorium, the ink still wet on his quill. Outside, villagers murmur in frightened tones, and above, the comet blazes. The monk does not simply record its presence, he interprets it. He might sketch it as a blazing sword, labeling it a portent of war, or he might describe it as a star trailing hair, a heavenly torch presaging fire and plague. His words will endure for centuries, shaping how future generations remember not just the comet, but the tragedies that followed in its wake. It was not only monks and kings who quaked at the sight. For ordinary people, the comet invaded every aspect of daily life. Farmers believed their crops would fail under its light. Shepherds whispered that livestock would sicken. Women feared that children born beneath a comet's glow would be cursed, doomed to short lives or misfortune. Each new fiery streak across the heavens seemed to threaten the fragile balance of survival. When your world already hung by a thread, a comet was the blade poised to cut it. Rituals sprang up to ward off the comet's wrath. Bells rang through the night, their iron voices echoing across valleys in an attempt to drown out whatever message the heavens were sending. Processions wound through muddy streets, barefoot penitents chanting prayers and hymns. In some places, offerings were burned in fields or wells blessed with holy water, desperate measures to appease a power no one could truly understand. The comet demanded a response, and silence was too dangerous an option. Yet even in the darkest fear, the comet inspired wonder. Some poets dared to describe its beauty, its shimmering tail spilling across the stars like a silver river. They admitted their terror, but also confessed awe, as if the very danger of the comet made it all the more captivating. This tension between dread and fascination gave the comet its strange hold on the medieval imagination. It was a visitor from another realm, terrifying yet impossible to look away from. The Church, of course, capitalized on this fear. Priests preached that comets were God's punishment for sin. They urged confession, penance, and obedience, warning that only through devotion could the community hope to escape destruction. Sometimes, entire villages were drawn into days of fasting, their bellies empty and voices hoarse from prayer, while the comet still blazed defiantly above. To question the comet's meaning was to risk being branded a heretic. Better to bow your head and join the chorus of the fearful. Astrologers, too, played their part. Kings demanded interpretations, and astrologers armed with charts and ancient texts struggled to provide answers. A comet might be declared favorable for one ruler and disastrous for his rival. Predictions were slippery things, easily reshaped to suit political needs. Yet even vague words carried enormous weight. A king might delay a campaign, raise taxes, or even execute a suspected traitor based on what the stars were said to declare. The comet's fire reached into politics as surely as it touched the night sky. Chronicles show how flexible comet superstition could be. If disaster followed, the comet was blamed. If fortune came instead, the comet was reinterpreted as a blessing. In this way, the comet could never be proven false. It was a mirror reflecting human hopes and fears, always available to justify whatever outcome history provided. The heavens, in medieval thought, never erred. Only humans erred in their interpretation. Folklore embroidered the fear with vivid details. In some places, people whispered that to point at a comet invited misfortune, as though the heavens resented being mocked. Others said that comets carried souls upon their fiery tails, ferrying the dead to judgment. Children were told not to stare too long, lest the comet snatch their innocence through their gaze. These stories gave shape to anxieties that words alone could not contain. They turned the comet into a living character in the drama of medieval life. Still, amid the fear, the comet united communities. People gathered in squares, on hillsides, in churchyards, all staring upward together. For a moment, the divisions of class and wealth blurred. Kings in their towers and peasants in their fields all felt the same chill as the sky burned. The comet was the one spectacle that none could ignore, the one event that bound the fates of every soul beneath its fiery arc. And when the comet finally faded, relief swept through villages like a blessing. Bells rang not in warning but in joy. Families returned to their work, and priests praised God for sparing them. Yet in the back of every mind lingered the memory of the fear, the reminder that the sky might blaze again without warning. Each comet etched itself into cultural memory, a scar on the psyche of a people who never knew when the next one might appear. From England to France, from Italy to the Holy Roman Empire, the story was the same. Comets meant upheaval, comets meant death. And yet, they also meant stories, chronicles, art, and legend. They gave shape to the uncertainties of a world where famine, war, and plague already loomed large. In this sense, comets were not intrusions but reflections of a fragile reality, symbols of a truth everyone already lived. Life in the Middle Ages was always on the brink of collapse. By the time we reached the 14th century, Europe had endured famine, plague, and ceaseless conflict. Against this backdrop, the comet was more than a sign. It was confirmation that the world was falling apart. Chroniclers wrote with grim certainty, recording each fiery appearance as though it were the very handwriting of God. And perhaps to them it was. Even today, when we read those manuscripts, the fear feels fresh. The ink may be faded, the vellum cracked, but the words still pulse with urgency. They are not detached observations. They are cries of terror, attempts to make sense of a universe that seemed hostile and alive. And through them, we glimpse the minds of people who lived under constant uncertainty, who looked upward at the night sky and saw not beauty, but judgment. In the end, the medieval comet was never just a comet. It was a canvas painted with the colors of fear, faith, and imagination. And to step into their world is to understand how fragile human certainty can be when the heavens themselves seem to burn. When the Black Death began its terrible sweep through Europe in the mid-14th century, people searched desperately for causes. They looked to the ground and found none, so they turned their eyes to the sky. And there, as if on cue, blazed a comet. Chroniclers wrote with chilling certainty that the plague was heralded by this fiery sign. Some described the comet as dripping poison into the air, others as dragging a trail of corruption behind it. To a terrified population, the link was obvious. The heavens had spoken and the earth was doomed to suffer. Reports spread of peasants standing in open fields, holding cloths and herbs over their faces, believing the comet's tail was breathing disease into the world. Medieval physicians, armed with little more than Galen's ancient texts and their own limited observation, sometimes echoed these fears. They spoke of miasma, the poisoned breath of the heavens, descending from the comet and infecting all beneath it. Even men of learning could not escape the dread. To them, as to the common farmer, the comet was not some distant phenomenon. It was a tangible danger, a fiery menace hanging directly over their lives. Monasteries recorded these fears in stark detail. In cloisters lit by flickering candles, monks wrote of nights when bells rang without pause, calling the faithful to prayer as the comet lingered above. Vigils stretched into dawn, the community gathered in whispered chants, imploring God to turn his wrath away. Relics were carried in solemn processions, lifted high against the glowing sky as if bones and fragments of saints could shield the living from pestilence. The comet was more than a sign. It was a catalyst, sparking acts of devotion that might otherwise never have been performed, and famine, too, was tied to these blazing visitors. In the early 14th century, when rains drowned crops and hunger stalked entire regions, chroniclers once again sought explanations in the heavens. A comet had appeared, they said, and the world responded with starvation. Families were reduced to eating bark and roots, villages abandoned their fields, and stories spread of desperate acts committed in the shadow of hunger. For those who endured such times, the comet was the spark that ignited disaster, a fiery herald that brought ruin to their tables. Folklore wrapped these fears in haunting stories. Children were warned never to stare at comets for too long, lest their eyes be seared with madness. Farmers whispered that animals would fall sick if left beneath a comet's glow. Travelers feared to venture out at night, convinced that spirits roamed the roads whenever a comet burned overhead. These tales, passed from mouth to mouth, gave form to anxieties that words alone could not hold. The comet became a character in their lives, sometimes a predator, sometimes a thief, always a threat. Communities often answered the comet with ritual. In the Rhineland, villagers carried torches into their fields, circling their crops as though earthly flames might protect against the one in the sky. In Italy, church bells rang without pause, their thunderous clangs echoing across valleys, a desperate attempt to drown out the comet's voice. In France, bowls of water were placed outside doors to reflect the comet's light, trapping its power before it could enter the household. These rituals were both symbolic and sincere, born of fear but also of hope. Fear, however, often demanded sacrifice. Some communities burned effigies in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Others turned against outsiders, foreign travelers, wandering beggars, or those accused of witchcraft, blaming them for drawing the comet's anger. In Strasbourg, chronicles describe trials and executions following the comet's appearance, where terror of the heavens justified cruelty on earth. The blazing light above became the spark that ignited human violence below. Yet there were also voices of wonder. A handful of poets described comets as heavenly torches, as banners unfurled across the night. They admitted fear, but also confessed awe, their words shimmering with reluctant admiration. To them, the comet was not just punishment, but a reminder of creation's vastness. These voices were rare, often drowned out by sermons of doom, but they proved that even in the darkest times, some could still see beauty in the blaze. The paradox of fear and wonder gave comets their enduring hold on medieval minds. Unlike the steady stars or predictable sun and moon, comets were unpredictable, wild and transient. They came without warning, lingered without schedule, and vanished without explanation. To a worldview that prized divine order, comets were ruptures in the design, cracks in the perfect sphere of the heavens. This unpredictability made them even more terrifying, because what could not be predicted could not be controlled. Astrologers tried to impose order where none seemed to exist. They charted the comet's path, measured its brightness, and placed it within the framework of planets and constellations. From this, they offered interpretations, some vague, some bold. Kings and princes demanded these readings. and decisions of war or peace sometimes hinged on the astrologer's words. The comet thus extended its power far beyond the sky, reaching into courts and councils through human belief. Consider the year 1456, when Halley's comet returned. Its appearance coincided with fear of Ottoman invasion, and Pope Calixtus III famously ordered bells rung and prayers offered to counteract what he declared a celestial threat. The comet became part of Europe's defense, woven into the narrative of Christian struggle against the advancing Turks. Here, the fiery visitor was not just a heavenly sign, it was a battlefield ally, an enemy, and a weapon all at once. This blending of heaven and earth gave comets immense symbolic weight. They could be angel swords, demons' torches, or the very breath of God. They appeared in manuscripts, stitched into tapestries, sung in ballads, and feared in sermons. They shaped choices in royal palaces and prayers in rural chapels. For those who lived beneath their glow, the comet was never distant. It was an intimate presence, a fiery messenger sent directly into their world. And yet, beyond Europe, other civilizations watched the same skies with different eyes. In China, imperial astronomers recorded comets with meticulous detail, measuring length, direction, and color with precision. Though omens were still attached, the emphasis was often on careful record-keeping. These records, stretching back centuries, now provide invaluable data for modern astronomy. To the Chinese court, the comet was a celestial event to be catalogued and interpreted. Yes, but also to be understood. In the Islamic world, scholars such as Al-Sufi and Al-Tusi included comets in their astronomical texts, approaching them with curiosity rather than terror. While rulers still sought guidance, the intellectual tradition leaned toward observation and classification. This did not erase superstition, but it tempered it with a spirit of inquiry that was less common in medieval Europe. Where Europe saw wrath, Islamic scholars began to see pattern. For even so, fear was never absent. A comet blazing unexpectedly could still unsettle a city or court, its strangeness too powerful to dismiss. The sense of otherworldliness clung to it, even when explained through charts and calculations. A streak of fire across the heavens resisted easy rationalization, inviting myth even as it invited science. What links all these accounts across continents and centuries is urgency. No chronicler ever described a comet casually. No villager ever ignored it as mere scenery. The comet demanded notice, demanded meaning. It was an intruder in the heavens, and to medieval minds an intruder demanded response. In this way, comets reveal something deeper about medieval life. They show us how fragile certainty was, how deeply people longed for signs and explanations. They show us how imagination rose to fill the gaps left by knowledge, how fear and hope alike were painted onto the canvas of the night sky. To live under a comet was to feel small and uncertain, to believe that heaven itself was speaking. And perhaps, in that raw awe, we can still find something familiar. The year 1097 saw a comet blaze over Europe just as crusaders marched toward the Holy Land. Chroniclers seized upon the coincidence, describing the fiery apparition as a sword drawn in the heavens. Some claimed it was God blessing the holy war, urging the faithful forward. Others whispered it was a warning of slaughter to come, a reminder that thousands would perish before reaching Jerusalem. In truth, both interpretations coexisted, showing how comets could be molded into whatever story the age demanded. In 1132, another comet lit the skies, and London soon endured one of the greatest fires in its history. To later readers, the connection seemed obvious. The heavens had announced the city's burning. But for those who lived through it, the comet was not merely a warning after the fact. It was a presence that filled the nights with dread, a blazing shadow that loomed over every decision. Comets were remembered not just as sights, but as participants in the tragedies that followed them. By 1230, reports of a comet drifting over France describe it as a torch set against the firmament, dripping sparks like tears. This poetic phrasing reveals the emotional impact such a sight had. It was not only light, it was sorrow. And when famine and unrest followed soon after, the sorrow seemed to have been written in advance upon the sky. A blazing omen, crying for the grief of men. Folklore shaped the comet into ever stranger forms. In some regions, people believed that to point at a comet was to invite its wrath, as if mockery or recognition would draw punishment. Others swore that washing clothes during a comet's presence would curse the fabric, ensuring misfortune to anyone who wore it. Parents frightened children with tales that comets were dragons in disguise, their fiery breath stretched across the heavens as a reminder that monsters were real and always watching. As centuries passed, these fears deepened rather than faded. The 14th century brought repeated disasters, famine, plague, and war that seemed to prove the comet's warnings true. When a fiery streak appeared in 1315, the same year rains drowned crops across Europe. Many declared the connection undeniable. The comet had poisoned the sky, and the earth had answered with hunger. To those who starved, the proof burned brightly overhead. The famine forced families to desperate measures. Reports tell of people boiling grass, gnawing bark, and even resorting to unthinkable acts. And always the comet lingered in their memory, its light casting an otherworldly glow upon nights already filled with sorrow. If hunger was punishment, the comet was the writ of judgment signed in the stars. In 1368, another comet streaked across the sky. In Florence, crowds filled the central piazza, praying and wailing beneath its fire. In Paris, church bells rang until the metal cracked from the strain. So urgently did priests call for repentance. Chroniclers insisted that plague returned soon after, carried on the fiery breath of the comet. Whether true or not, the connection was cemented. Where comets blazed, pestilence followed. The fear of comets extended into royal courts. Kings lost sleep, their astrologers debating late into the night whether the throne itself was threatened. Nobles feared that rebellion would follow the comet's trail, and generals wondered whether battle would turn against them. For rulers, a comet was more than spectacle. It was a question of power, legitimacy, and survival. One false interpretation, one misstep in the face of heavenly fire, could mean the end of a dynasty. The link between comets and rulers' deaths was repeated so often, it became a certainty. In 1402, a comet appeared shortly before the death of Albert I of Germany. In 1456, Halley's comet coincided with fears of Ottoman invasion, and Pope Calixtus III decreed that prayers be said worldwide to counter its threat. In 1472, yet another comet appeared, and chronicles tied it to wars, plagues, and storms. The pattern seemed endless. To medieval minds, rulers and comets were bound together by fate. Art reflected these beliefs with chilling imagery. Manuscripts depicted comets as swords, crosses, or serpents, each shape interpreted as a different warning. A sword meant war, a cross meant divine judgment, a serpent meant betrayal or pestilence. These were not idle drawings, they were serious records of what people saw and what they believed it meant, passed down as warnings to future generations. The wider the tale, the greater the fear. Chroniclers often described comets as stretching across the entire sky, their length interpreted as the measure of disaster. A short comet might mean a local famine. A long-tailed comet could mean a plague that swept across kingdoms. The heavens themselves, people thought, scaled disaster according to the brightness and size of the fiery streak. Some records from monasteries describe comets as hissing, roaring, or even crackling with sound. These embellishments reveal more than they conceal. They show how the human imagination filled in the terror of the unknown. If the comet was already a message, why shouldn't it whisper, shout, or breathe fire? In fear, the line between observation and invention blurred easily. The global stage continued to provide contrasting views. Chinese astronomers catalogued the same comets with methodical detail, while in Europe, monks clutched relics and nobles summoned astrologers. The same light was seen in the sky, but it was interpreted through two entirely different lenses, one of science budding in the east, one of superstition flourishing in the west. In the Islamic world, comets appeared in both scholarly texts and sermons. Scholars measured and charted them, but imams still warned of their meaning. This dual approach, curiosity paired with caution, shows how even a culture steeped in learning could not fully banish fear. For all its scholarship, the comet still carried weight as a divine sign, as if its brilliance demanded spiritual as well as scientific attention. Meanwhile, in Europe, communities responded with increasing fervor. Barefoot processions wound through villages, men and women crying out for forgiveness as the comet blazed. Some lashed their own backs, blood mixing with mud, believing that sacrifice might appease the wrath above. Others clutched holy relics or charms, whispering prayers to saints whose bones might shield them from the heavens. Every ritual was an attempt to bargain with a force too powerful to ignore. There were always consequences. Suspicion fell on outsiders, the poor, or those with unusual habits. Witches were accused of drawing power from the comet, of harnessing its fire for spells. In some villages, suspected witches were hunted and burned during comet years, their deaths offered as desperate appeasement. The comet's blaze was mirrored in the flames of pyres, and fear consumed not only the sky, but human lives. And still, through all the terror, comets inspired stories that captured imagination as much as fear. They were dragons, swords, crosses, serpents, torches, ghosts. They were signs and messengers, allies and enemies. They were whatever people most feared or most needed to see. And that ability to absorb human imagination made them irresistible. When the comet finally faded, relief swept over the land like rain on parched earth. Bells rang in joy, families returned to their routines, and kings breathed easier. But the memory lingered. Each comet etched itself into collective memory, becoming part of chronicles, sermons, songs, and tales. Each one was added to the long ledger of omens, waiting to be compared to the next fiery visitor. By the 15th century, Europe had been reshaped by famine, plague, and endless wars. Against this backdrop of uncertainty, comets seemed like old companions, always returning when disaster was near. Chronicles describe them with increasing frequency, each entry tinged with dread. The sight of a comet no longer startled. It confirmed what people already suspected, that suffering was never far away. In 1456, Halley's comet appeared once again. To modernize, it was the same icy traveler that had visited before and would visit again. But to Pope Calixtus III and the faithful of Europe, it was an omen of grave danger. The Ottoman Empire threatened Christian lands, and the comet's blaze was taken as divine confirmation of the peril. The Pope ordered bells to be rung at noon each day, prayers to be offered, and fasting to be observed. The comet was treated as an enemy to be fought with piety, as though prayer could extinguish its fiery tail. This blending of political crisis with heavenly spectacle made comets tools of persuasion. A ruler could point to the sky and say, "See, even the heavens agree with me." The Pope's call for prayers did more than address fear. It united people under a common ritual, strengthening his authority at a time of crisis. The comet became not just a light in the sky, but a rallying cry, an emblem of struggle against earthly foes. 2 decades later, in 1472, another great comet blazed across Europe. Chroniclers described it as enormous, its tail stretching halfway across the sky. Artists later depicted it in manuscripts as a flaming sword, so vast that it seemed to divide heaven itself. Predictions abounded. Some said it meant pestilence, others war, others the fall of kingdoms. That year saw both political turmoil and outbreaks of disease, ensuring that the comet's reputation as a herald of catastrophe was reinforced once more. Villagers responded with the same rituals as before: bells, processions, fasting. But by the late 15th century, a faint note of curiosity had begun to creep into the records. Some observers began noting how long the comet lasted, where it moved, and what shape it took. The descriptions were still wrapped in fear, but they carried the seeds of something new: observation for its own sake. Art of the period reflects this duality. Comets were still painted as swords or crosses, but some manuscripts attempted to capture their natural appearance more faithfully. Long, pale tails, glowing heads, the sense of motion across the stars. The very act of trying to represent them accurately hinted that not everyone was content to see only omens. Some wanted to see what was actually there. Astrologers continued to hold immense sway, but their predictions grew increasingly elaborate. They linked comets not only to kings and wars, but to floods, earthquakes, and even the temperament of unborn children. The desire to extract meaning from every detail led to interpretations that grew more fantastical by the year. Yet behind this, careful notes on brightness, position, and duration slipped quietly into their texts, preserving valuable data even as superstition dominated the conclusions. By the close of the 15th century, Europe stood on the edge of profound change. Printing presses were spreading knowledge more widely. Explorers were crossing oceans, expanding the known world. And in the night sky, comets continued to blaze, still feared, but increasingly documented. The balance between myth and science was beginning to shift, though few realized it at the time. The 16th century brought comets that challenged old beliefs more directly. In 1531, Halley's Comet appeared once again. Observers in different lands recorded its presence with care, and for the first time, comparisons between accounts began to emerge. Scholars noticed similarities between comets seen decades apart, planting the earliest seeds of the realization that these were not random visitors, but recurring travelers. The idea was fragile, but it marked the beginning of a new way of seeing. Still, fear remained deeply entrenched. Martin Luther himself, writing in the early 16th century, called comets horrible tokens of God's wrath, signs of judgment sent to warn the world. His words carried weight, reinforcing the old view that comets were divine punishments. For every scholar who dared to suggest that comets might follow natural laws, there were dozens of preachers ready to declare them heralds of doom. The comet of 1577 provided one of the most important turning points. It was observed across Europe, and among those who studied it was Tycho Brahe, the great Danish astronomer. Using careful measurements, Tycho proved that the comet was not an atmospheric phenomenon, as Aristotle had claimed, but a celestial object moving through space. This was revolutionary. For centuries, comets had been thought to belong to the realm of weather, fleeting vapors that appeared in the air. Tycho showed they were far more distant, part of the heavens themselves. The implications were staggering. If comets could travel through the supposedly perfect, unchanging heavens, then the Aristotelian model of the universe was wrong. The comet of 1577 cracked open the old belief that the heavens were immutable. It forced scholars to reconsider the very structure of the cosmos. What had once been a terrifying omen became, in Tycho's hands, a clue to a greater truth. But this revelation did not erase centuries of fear overnight. For ordinary people, the comet of 1577 was still a harbinger of doom. Pamphlets circulated with grim predictions, warning of war, famine, and plague. Sermons thundered that God's wrath was upon the land. The scientific insight lived side by side with superstition, the two worlds overlapping uneasily in the minds of the people. Tycho's work, however, marked a milestone. He had shown that comets could be studied, measured, and understood. His data would later help Johannes Kepler formulate his laws of planetary motion, which in turn laid the groundwork for Newton. The fiery visitors of the night sky, once feared as omens, were slowly becoming subjects of science. Even so, the tension between fear and knowledge endured. In 1618, a series of bright comets appeared, and Europe reacted with both fascination and dread. Scholars like Kepler observed them with interest, while preachers thundered from pulpits about judgment. Wars raged across the continent, and people eagerly tied the comets to every calamity. For them, the heavens still spoke, even if scholars were beginning to say otherwise. The persistence of fear reminds us how deep-rooted these beliefs were. Knowledge spreads slowly, and superstition clings tightly, especially in times of crisis. For villagers who had no access to Tycho's measurements or Kepler's theories, the comet remained what it had always been: a fiery messenger of disaster, a warning painted across the night. Thus, the medieval and early modern experience of comets was a tapestry woven of both dread and discovery. On one thread ran the fear of pestilence, famine, and death. On the other, the careful notes of scholars inching toward truth. The two threads overlapped and tangled, forming a picture at once dark and luminous, reflecting both the terror of the unknown and the first sparks of enlightenment. By the 17th century, the old medieval reflex to hear the heavens as language was still alive, even as a new habit of measuring took root. Europe had learned to print, to sail across oceans, to argue in public about theology, and yet a bright comet could still drain color from the faces of villagers and princes alike. The sky did not argue, it arrived. When it did, it gathered fears like a magnet. Courts summoned astrologers with velvet bindings and brass instruments. Parishes rang bells until ropes burned palms. But alongside the ritual, notebooks opened, angles were sketched, durations were timed. Each blazing visitor now entered two ledgers at once, the old Book of Omens and the new Book of Numbers. In 1680, a comet rose so severe and immaculate, it seemed to unsheathe the night. It was bright at dawn, brighter at dusk, a curve of white steel above frost-hardened fields. Isaac Newton bent its path to ink and reason, showing that whatever terror it inspired, it still yielded to gravity's patient law. This was not the end of superstition, but an inflection. People learned that comets were not arbitrary slashes, but participants in a larger choreography, subject to the same rule that steadied planets and apples. Yet knowledge did not cancel drama. The farmer still stared, the child still shivered, and the priest still stepped to his pulpit with a page on which fear and faith had traded places 100 times before. Edmund Halley offered something new, not an interpretation, but a promise. He compared three apparitions, 1531, 1607, and 1682, and argued they were one traveler, punctual in a way only hidden order can be. He wagered his reputation that it would return in 1758, a bet against caprice itself. When, years after his death, the comet sauntered back on schedule, the heavens yielded a concession to human patience. 1,000 sermons had said comets were divine interruptions. A single prediction hinted they could be divine repetitions. Even so, repetition has moods. Across Europe, some toasted Halley's courage, while others glanced uneasily skyward, aware that a clock can chime joy or doom depending on what the hour contains. The 18th century taught another lesson. Fear changes costume, not substance. Newspapers reported comets with a jaunty tone, yet broadsides still hawked provisional prophecies. Telescopes lengthened human eyes, engravers spread tidy diagrams, coffeehouses buzzed with confident talk. And then a rumor would crawl through a crowd that the tale contained poison, that the year would bring war, that a king looked suddenly unwell, and the old pulse quickened. If the Middle Ages had knelt, the Enlightenment paced, but both postures were responses to the same pressure, a sky capable of surprise. The difference was not that wonder ended. It learned to share a bench with method, to let curiosity put its hand on dread's shoulder and say, "Stay, let's watch a little longer." 19th century skies embroidered themselves with spectacle. Donati's comet in 1858 curved like a calligrapher's flourish, an elegant scythe drawn across velvet. Painters tried to bottle it in pigment. Poets pressed it between the pages of sonnets. Lecturers rented halls and brought home-built telescopes to tavern gardens. Some Victorians took it as a parable of progress, the universe unveiling pattern to industrious minds. Others felt something older stirring, a hush that predates steam and steel, because the curve looked like judgment's blade. Even Napoleon's life was retrofitted with cometry, his rise and campaigns glossed by celestial punctuation. We are ingenious explainers and stubborn myth-makers both. The century proved how fluently we can be two things at once. Then 1910 returned Halley and revealed how rumor loves modern tools. Wires hummed, presses clattered. Headlines magnified a stray scientific note about cyanogen into theatrical menace. Merchants sold anti-comet tonics. Amateur inventors advertised filtered masks. Some families sealed windows with oilcloth, as if winter were returning overnight. The spectacle of fear was almost festive, part carnival, part catechism. Yet beneath the jokes lived a medieval reflex. Strange lights must carry strange laws. Cities with electric boulevards reenacted village superstitions in new costumes. One could measure the tale's spectrum with a prism and still feel one's own pulse counting backward, centuries at a time, to bells in the fog and penitents with rope-scarred shoulders. The 20th century complicated everything further. Sputnik taught us the sky could be a workshop. Apollo taught us it could be a destination. And still, when Hale-Bopp shouldered up in 1997, people stepped outside, tilted their heads, and fell silent. For many, the experience felt clean. No sermon, no omen, just the agreeable astonishment of seeing something large and old glide over the housetops. For others, an undertow tugged at older stories. Even delight can wear a shadow. Standing in cul-de-sacs and on farmhouse stoops, we resembled our medieval predecessors in posture, if not philosophy. Breath visible, conversation soft, eyes tugged skyward by a visitor who neither knew nor cared that it was being watched. So what do these centuries of watching amount to? First, that superstition was an energy management system for fragile lives. Medieval communities metabolized risk by assigning pattern to danger and ritual to pattern. Bells were not just sound, they were agency. Processions were not just movement, they were solidarity under a shared sky. Second, that science did not arrive to sneer, but to organize. Tycho's parallax, Kepler's ellipses, Newton's calculus, each offered gentler scaffolding for awe, a way to keep wonder without surrendering to panic. The result is not a victory of one over the other, but a layering, myth close to the skin, method in the bones. Consider the parish chronicler, call him Thomas, scratching by candlelight, recording a hairy star that lingered for 6 weeks and paled after rain. His ink is thick, his Latin serviceable, his fear obvious between the lines. Now consider the physics teacher, call her Ms. Rivera, guiding students to plot a comet's apparent motion night by night. Her marker squeaks, her voice steadies, her students' graphs bend into authority. Between Thomas and Ms. Rivera stretches 500 years and a single human gesture. Pointing, then writing, then pointing again. The continuity is not an accident. The comet asks us to look up, and looking up recruits every tool we have, from prayer to parallax. If you trace a comet farther back, beyond peasants and popes, beyond classicists and cosmologists, you find something more elemental: interruption. Comets violate expectation. They insert punctuation into a sentence we thought we were writing without commas. Medieval people heard that punctuation as doom. We are freer to hear it as emphasis, but both hearings assume the same premise. The sentence matters. A life is a line. A year is a clause. A streak across winter is grammar so sudden we have to stop and reread the page. That halting, half fearful, half grateful, is as human as language itself. Mystery too survives translation. The data are better, the ore is not smaller. A spectrograph can tell us about water and carbon monoxide. A probe can taste dust older than Earth. Yet none of these victories abolish the shiver when the first pale smear appears above a roofline. Medieval sermons warned that such shivers were the conscience waking. Modern guides say they are beauty doing its work. Perhaps both are right. Perhaps the shiver is what happens when scale tilts, when we feel the magnitude of what is not us and cannot be managed by us, and choose reverence over retreat. Return for a moment to that village we visited at the start. The bells are tolling, the square is full, the comet has drawn a pale spear across the sky. Someone prays loudly, someone weeps, someone pretends not to be afraid for the sake of the others. Now fold that scene into a modern one. A family on a balcony, phones dimmed, neighborhood quiet for once. The same hush arrives, the same instinct to make the moment plural. Look passes from mouth to mouth. The centuries between them shrink like a shadow at noon, because the sky is the one ceiling that remembers every face turned toward it. Medieval fear did harm, we must say that plainly. Under comets, scapegoats burned, outsiders bled, and frightened councils signed hard decrees. The record is not only bells and penance, it is pyres and prisons. And yet even here the comet teaches. When the unknown presses, our choices matter. We can braid fear into cruelty, or we can braid it into care. The same pressure that once justified violence can, under different stories, justify solidarity. Nights of shared cocoa and blankets on stairs, science nights at schools, neighbors trading binoculars at the curb. If we grant medieval people their context, a world thinly insulated from death, we can read their comet pages with compassion. They were not foolish for reaching toward explanations that their tools allowed. They were human. Our tools are better. Our obligation is therefore heavier. We are called to keep the wonder, discard the harm, and add wisdom. That means teaching children that a blaze in the sky can be a chapter heading rather than a verdict, an invitation to curiosity rather than a summons to panic. And what of faith? Comets did not evacuate theology, they refined it. Many believers now hold together two truths without strain. that a comet obeys gravity and that its appearance can still remind us to make amends, to widen our circles, to live more attentively under a patient heaven. Such synthesis would have been rare in the 13th century. It is a live option now, and a gracious one, because it refuses the false choice between meaning and measurement. The comet, that old examiner of human posture, seems to nod as it passes. Both, if you will. Imagine the next great visitor rising over your horizon. The news will carry images within minutes. Social feeds will braid excitement with jokes. A school will announce a parking lot viewing. You step outside. A smear becomes a blade becomes a banner, and the banner grows a tail that seems to scratch at constellations you almost remember from summer. You know the facts. You also feel the hush. Your mind holds the period of its orbit. Your chest holds something periodless and sincere. In that overlap, fact nested inside feeling, you join a lineage older than your language. Even in the modern age, comets continue to act as silent tests of how much fear and wonder coexist in us. We can measure their composition with spectrographs and fly spacecraft past their icy cores, yet when one blazes overhead, conversation still shifts in uncanny ways. Neighbors linger longer on porches, journalists scramble for metaphors, and social feeds fill with images tinged by awe. The rational explanation satisfies the mind, but the sight still stirs something older and more mysterious in the chest. The medieval villager and the modern scientist are separated by centuries, but both feel that pulse of interruption when the sky writes a sudden sentence across the stars. Think of comets as reminders that the universe does not belong to us, no matter how many satellites we launch or telescopes we build. They arrive without our invitation and remain untouched by our schedules. In this sense, comets are democratic. They appear to the shepherd and the scholar alike, leveling hierarchy with their indifference. Medieval superstition exaggerated this leveling into terror. Everyone could be judged, no one could hide. But beneath the fear was also a kind of unity. The same unity appears today when people gather on hillsides or rooftops, craning their necks in unison, becoming for a moment a single audience to the theater of the sky. There is also something profoundly humbling in how comets remind us of time. Their orbits stretch beyond generations, beyond the rise and fall of empires. A comet that terrifies one century may return to inspire delight in another. Its passage a cosmic metronome against which human history looks small. Medieval chronicles tied comets to specific plagues or wars, but modern science reveals their cycles to be vast, indifferent to our struggles. And yet, that very indifference grants them symbolic power. They remind us that our crises, however fierce, are brief sparks compared to the long, cold journeys of these celestial wanderers. Perhaps this is why comets linger in literature and myth, even after astronomy claimed them. They serve as metaphors for disruption, for brilliance, for the fleeting and the eternal combined. Writers describe lovers as comets, revolutions as comets, moments of genius as comets. The medieval fear that they were divine handwriting has not entirely vanished. It has simply been translated into new languages of meaning. We may not fear famine from their glow, but we still sense that a comet is not just another object. It is a messenger of change, whispering that the ordinary is about to be disturbed. So when you next read about a comet or see one streak across the night, remember that you are joining an ancient ritual of watching. The bells may be silent, the processions gone, the sermons fewer, but the act of lifting your gaze remains. You stand in a line of witnesses stretching back 1,000 years, each one making sense of the blaze in their own way. For medieval Europe, it was a sentence of doom. For us, it can be an invitation to curiosity, humility, and wonder. And in that continuity lies the true story of comets, not merely as omens or objects, but as eternal companions in the human habit of looking up. At last, the comet thins, its plume unwinds, and the sky reverts to its ordinary registers. What remains is not an answer, but a posture, head up, breath steady, a willingness to be revised by what exceeds you. Medieval Europe met comets with strategies born of scarcity. We can meet them with strategies born of plenty, time to learn, instruments to share, communities that choose gentleness when the strange arrives. The blaze withdraws, the invitation lingers. The night is again a sentence without commas, until, of course, the next one writes itself into our margin. Here, then, is the thread that runs from plague vigil to backyard viewing party. Comets reveal how we handle interruption. We can panic or pray, injure or include, mythologize or measure, or if we are wise, braid those responses into a rope strong enough to pull us through. Medieval people chose one braid. We can choose another. The sky will keep sending us material. The lesson is not to fear punctuation, but to read it well, to answer it with better sentences than our ancestors could afford to write. So keep your coat by the door and your questions near your tongue. Keep a map handy and an apology or two ready in case wonder asks for humility. When the next traveler appears, give it a name, then give it your attention. Teach what you know, admit what you don't, and let the old bell inside your ribs ring without shame. You live in an age that can compute a path through darkness. You also live in a body that knows how to stand still and look up. Both are gifts. And when you finally turn back inside, remember, the medieval not as strangers, but as kin who stood where you stand, shivering from weather and meaning both. Their chronicles were rough drafts of a story we continue to write, how to greet the unfamiliar without harming one another, how to convert astonishment into care. The comet will be gone, but the habit of looking will remain. That habit is how we graduate from omen to orbit, from fear to attention, from the fantasy that the heavens accuse us to the truth that they invite us. Step into that invitation the next time the dark brightens. The sky will meet you halfway.